In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, and American economists celebrated what they called the peace dividend of globalization, the idea that rich countries could focus on innovation and services while emerging economies handled the messy business of actually making things. 23 years later, the United States finds itself unable to manufacture enough artillery shells for Ukraine without retooling factories that have been dormant since the 1980s. This would be unremarkable if it weren't the exact same story we can excavate from the ruins of every major empire in recorded history. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder complained in 77 AD that Rome was hemorrhaging gold to India and China for manufactured goods, silk, spices, and yes, even steel. By the 5th century, Rome couldn't produce enough weapons to defend itself. In 1776, Adam Smith described Britain as the workshop of the world. By 1976, Britain was asking the IMF for a bailout, having outsourced its manufacturing to former colonies and anyone else who'd do it cheaper. The Dutch did it, the Spanish did it, the Mongols did it, which is wild because they were nomads. What we're watching in real time with American manufacturing and increasingly European manufacturing is not a new phenomenon. It's a rerun. And the thing is, every empire that's played this tape has ended up in the same place. Economically weakened, militarily vulnerable, and wondering how they lost something that once seemed so permanent. So let's excavate this pattern. We're going to look at 3 questions. First, what exactly is the mechanism here? Why does outsourcing manufacturing seem to trigger imperial decline across such different civilizations and time periods? Second, is this actually correlation or causation? Because maybe empires outsource manufacturing because they're already declining, not the other way around. And third, and this is the uncomfortable one, if this pattern is real, what does it mean for the current global hegemon that's been outsourcing manufacturing for 40 years? Cool, so let's start with Rome, because the archaeological evidence here is surprisingly detailed. In the 1st century AD, Rome controlled the Mediterranean, the world's most valuable trade network. The empire had conquered everyone worth conquering. And it was rich, extraordinarily rich. Rich enough that Roman elites started asking themselves, why would we get our hands dirty with manufacturing when we can just buy finished goods from the provinces? The historian Pliny the Elder actually calculated that Rome was sending roughly 100 million sesterces per year to India alone for manufactured goods. To put that in context, that's about 50 million days' wages for a skilled Roman worker every year, just to India, for things like steel tools, textiles, and luxury items that Rome used to make itself. Now, you might think, okay, but that's just luxury goods, right? Who cares if rich Romans are buying silk from China? Except it wasn't just luxury goods. By the 3rd century, Rome was importing basic manufactured items, pottery, tools, weapons components, from its own provinces and beyond. A 2019 archaeological study by researchers at the University of Exeter found that iron production in Britain actually increased after the Roman conquest, while iron production in Italy decreased. The empire was literally outsourcing weapons production to the frontier provinces. And here's where it gets interesting. As Roman manufacturing declined, something else declined with it: technical knowledge. The archaeological record shows Roman engineering peaked around 100 AD and then just stopped advancing. By 300 AD, Romans were building smaller, simpler structures than their ancestors had. Not because they were stupid, but because they'd lost the industrial base that supported engineering innovation. The empire that had invented concrete couldn't figure out how to make it anymore by the time it fell. They had the recipe. They just lacked the integrated supply chains and skilled labor to execute it at scale. Now, let's jump forward 1,500 years to an empire that was paying very close attention to history. The British were obsessed with Roman history. They saw themselves as Rome 2.0. They were not going to make the same mistakes. And then they did, almost exactly. In 1870, Britain produced about 40% of the world's manufactured goods. The phrase "workshop of the world" wasn't marketing, it was literal. If you wanted steel, textiles, machinery, or chemicals, you came to Britain. By 1950, Britain produced about 10% of the world's manufactured goods. By 2000, less than 4%. What happened? Well, the British Empire happened. Here's the mechanism. Britain got rich from manufacturing, which allowed it to build an empire, which gave it access to cheap labor in India, Africa, and the Caribbean, which made British-made goods expensive by comparison, which incentivized British capital to invest in manufacturing facilities in the colonies rather than in Manchester or Birmingham. A 1957 study by economists at the London School of Economics found that by 1930, British investment in overseas manufacturing exceeded domestic manufacturing investment for the first time in history. British capitalists were literally choosing to build factories in India rather than England because labor was cheaper, and the colonial government guaranteed their property rights. This seemed rational. Each individual decision made perfect sense, but the aggregate effect was the systematic dismantling of Britain's industrial base. And here's the thing: the British discovered that the Romans could have told them. When you outsource manufacturing, you don't just lose the jobs. You lose the ecosystem of knowledge that surrounds manufacturing. You lose the metallurgists who understand why one steel alloy behaves differently than another. You lose the tool and die makers who can design new equipment. You lose the supply chains that can pivot during emergencies. When World War II started, Britain discovered it couldn't produce enough aircraft, weapons, or even uniforms without massive American assistance. The workshop of the world had to import weapons to defend itself. Churchill literally described this as Britain's darkest hour, the moment the empire realized it had outsourced its own sovereignty. Which brings us to the present day. And I know what you're thinking. Sure, but America is different. We're a service economy. We innovate. We let other countries do the boring manufacturing while we focus on high-value activities like software and finance. Cool. Let me tell you what the British said in 1960. We're a financial economy. We innovate. We let other countries do the boring manufacturing while we focus on high-value activities like banking and insurance. I'm not saying it's the same situation. I'm saying the language is identical. Let's look at the data. In 1980, manufacturing was about 20% of U.S. GDP. Today, it's about 11%. In 1980, about 19 million Americans worked in manufacturing. Today, it's about 13 million, despite the population increasing by 100 million people. But here's the more interesting number. In 1990, the U.S. had about 385,000 manufacturing establishments. Today, it has about 293,000. We didn't just lose jobs, we lost entire categories of industrial capacity. A 2023 study by the Department of Defense found that the U.S. cannot domestically produce certain categories of semiconductors, rare earth magnets, ammunition, and even basic fasteners at the scale needed for a major conflict. The Pentagon literally maintains something called the National Defense Stockpile because we've outsourced so much manufacturing that we can't surge production in an emergency. Remember those artillery shells for Ukraine I mentioned? As of 2024, the U.S. produces about 28,000 rounds per month. Ukraine uses about 90,000 rounds per month. Russia produces roughly 250,000 per month. In a war of industrial production, which is what every major war becomes, United States is currently bringing a knife to a gunfight. Now, you might say, okay, but we can just rebuild those factories if we need to. It's not complicated, except it is complicated, because manufacturing isn't just factories, it's ecosystems. When the last American television factory closed in 2016, we didn't just lose the ability to assemble TVs. We lost the engineers who understood display technology, the supply chains for components, the quality control systems, and the institutional knowledge about how to solve problems at scale. This is what historians call industrial forgetting, and it's shockingly hard to reverse. Britain still hasn't fully recovered the manufacturing capacity it lost between 1970 and 2000, 50 years later. All right, so we've established the pattern exists across multiple empires. Now let's dig into why it happens, because the mechanism is actually kind of insidious. It starts with success. An empire becomes powerful through some combination of military conquest, trade networks, and, crucially, superior manufacturing. Rome made better weapons and tools. Britain made better ships and textiles. America made better cars and aircraft. That manufacturing success generates wealth, which allows the empire to expand, which provides access to cheaper labor in conquered or trade partner territories. And here's where the trap springs. Manufacturing starts moving to wherever labor is cheapest, because each individual capitalist or business owner is just trying to maximize their profit. Nobody is thinking about the empire-wide strategic implications. The empire's elites tell themselves a story. We're moving up the value chain. Let less developed regions handle basic manufacturing while we focus on innovation, finance, and services. This story is extremely appealing because it sounds sophisticated and it justifies people getting rich without getting their hands dirty. But manufacturing and innovation aren't separate activities. They're deeply intertwined. A 2018 study by researchers at MIT found that when you separate the people designing products from the people making products, innovation slows down. The tacit knowledge that comes from actually building things cannot be fully captured in blueprints or specifications. When American companies outsourced iPhone production to China, they didn't just outsource assembly, they outsourced learning about battery technology, supply chain optimization, and miniaturization. And guess who now leads the world in battery technology? It's not the United States. So the mechanism is manufacturing leaves, innovation slows, competitive advantage erodes, empire weakens. Empire can no longer afford the military or economic power that protected its interests. Other powers rise to fill the vacuum. The cycle takes roughly 100 to 200 years to play out completely, which is longer than any individual's lifetime, so it's really hard for people living through it to recognize the pattern. Now, I need to acknowledge the strongest criticism of this whole framework, which is that maybe I've got the causation backwards. Maybe empires don't decline because they outsource manufacturing. Maybe they outsource manufacturing because they're already declining. Because the institutions are getting sclerotic, the population is getting older and less entrepreneurial, innovation is slowing for other reasons, and so capital naturally seeks higher returns overseas. This is the argument of economists like Ricardo. And comparative advantage theory, countries should specialize in what they do best and trade for everything else. If China can make steel more efficiently than America, both countries benefit when America specializes in software and buys Chinese steel. And look, there's truth to this. The problem is that comparative advantage assumes countries don't care about strategic independence, which is fine in peacetime, but catastrophic in conflict. There's also the argument that correlation isn't causation. Maybe something else causes both outsourcing and imperial decline, like political dysfunction, overexpansion, or cultural decadence. The Romans were definitely politically dysfunctional by 300 AD for reasons that had nothing to do with manufacturing. I'll be honest, I don't think we can definitively prove causation here. What we can say is that the pattern holds across multiple empires with very different political systems, cultures, and specific circumstances. That suggests there's something real about the connection between manufacturing and imperial power, even if it's not the only factor. Here's where this gets really interesting. China is currently the world's manufacturer. In 2023, China produced about 31% of global manufactured goods, more than the US, Japan, and Germany combined. The question is, will China follow the same pattern? Will they outsource their manufacturing once they get rich enough, triggering their own decline? There's some evidence they're already starting. Chinese wages have increased dramatically. Average manufacturing wages in China are now higher than in Mexico, Vietnam, or much of Eastern Europe. Chinese companies are opening factories in Bangladesh, Ethiopia, and Cambodia. The pattern is beginning. But, and this is the thing that keeps me up at night, what if China studied this pattern and decided not to repeat it? The Chinese Communist Party is obsessed with the fall of empires. Xi Jinping has explicitly referenced the fall of Rome, the Soviet Union, and the British Empire as cautionary tales. In 2015, China announced Made in China 2025, a strategic plan to maintain manufacturing dominance even as they develop services and innovation. They're trying to do something no empire has successfully done: stay rich and stay industrial. Will it work? I have no idea. But the fact that they're consciously trying to avoid the historical pattern is itself significant. So what does all this mean for the United States? Well, if the pattern holds, and it has held for literally every empire in recorded history, then America is somewhere in the middle chapters of a very old story. We're past the point where Britain was in 1870, but not yet where Britain was in 1950. The optimistic take is that we still have time to reverse course. We could, theoretically, rebuild manufacturing capacity. We could prioritize industrial policy over pure market efficiency. We could accept slightly higher costs in exchange for strategic independence. The pessimistic take is that this never works because the economic incentives are too strong. Every individual actor, every company, every investor, every consumer benefits from outsourcing and cheap imports. The costs are diffuse and long-term. The benefits are concentrated and immediate, so the pattern continues until it can't. And the thing is, both takes can be true. We probably could reverse course if we wanted to, badly enough, but we probably won't want to badly enough until it's too late. I know this is dark, and I'm sure the comments will split between "you're exaggerating" and "we're already doomed." But the archaeological evidence is pretty clear. When empires outsource the fundamental capacity to make things, they lose the foundation of their power. The question isn't whether this pattern exists, it's whether we're the generation that finally breaks it. So let me bring this back to where we started. The United States can't produce enough artillery shells for Ukraine without a multi-year retooling effort. Rome couldn't produce enough weapons to defend itself by the 5th century. Britain couldn't produce enough weapons to defend itself by the 1940s. Is this the same story? I don't know. Maybe America really is different. Maybe the service economy model works when your services are software and finance rather than just banking. Maybe China will hit the same wall, and we'll all learn that no one can escape this pattern. Or maybe, and this is the thing that makes this more than just historical determinism, maybe understanding the pattern is the first step to breaking it. The Romans didn't know they were following a pattern. The British thought they were being rational. We have the advantage of seeing the archaeological evidence from 3,000 years of empires making the same mistake. The question is whether that knowledge matters. Anyway, that's the video. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the ruins of industrial policy across civilizations, please consider liking and subscribing. If you hated it and think I'm completely wrong, the comments are below. But at least we're all thinking about this instead of pretending it's not happening. And if you're an economist who wants to yell at me about comparative advantage, I already know. I took the same econ classes you did. I'm just not convinced Ricardo accounted for the part where your trade partners might eventually decide to invade you. See you next time.